Hi everybody. Hi Bob, Andrew, and Omar. And hi Chris. I'm inviting Chris. I haven't seen you for a long time. So, y-
Hello. The
yeah,
room
so
title caught my eye.
yeah, thank you for
Hey everybody,
here. I'm
great to be
actually
here.
looking for you, Chris. I need something from you. I'll communicate with you
Sure,
later.
send me a message.
And anyway, we have our guest speakers here, Andrew and Omar. I would just like to test their sound. Hi, Andrew and Omar. Can you please unmute your mic so that we can hear you?
Cecile, hi, great to be here.
Hi, Andrew and Omar.
Hi, this is Omar.
Hi, thank you for coming and welcome to Quantum Photonics. So, we have a very interesting topic today, and I would like to tell you that we have some slides on the screen, up on the screen, and I will be posting a copy of their study and also a popular article that had featured their work here at the room chat in a short while. I would like to introduce the topic based on the paper that our guest speakers have. So, as the automotive industry shifts from traditional internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, there's been a common belief that fewer workers would be needed, up to 30% less, because EVs are simpler to assemble. However, this study reveals a different reality. Using public data, researchers found that in US vehicle assembly plants that have fully transitioned to EV production, the labor required has actually increased significantly. During the early stages of EV production, labor intensity, essentially the amount of work needed, rose over tenfold compared to what was needed for traditional combustion vehicles. Even after a decade, one plant studied still required three times more workers than it did before. This suggests that the transition to EVs may take much longer than expected to match the efficiency of the ICE vehicle production. These findings challenge the fear that the rapid job loss will happen in EVs when they take over. Instead, it shows that employment in assembly plants is likely to remain higher for some time. The study also calls for more region specific research to understand how this shift is impacting workforce across different regions and how to best plan for the future of automotive jobs. So it has been a great question in my community for some time. And of course, I want to inform you that I'm also in the vehicle assembly industry. We are supplying robotic spot welding equipments for the car manufacturing companies in Asia. So I'm very much familiar with this industry. And also at the same time, before Elon Musk made his open production, we already have that in the Japanese car manufacturing companies. So people are very scared about disruptive industries coming in, and they have the question of when will robots take over our jobs. So a great example of a disruptive industry initially feared to take away jobs but ultimately creating, as at least for now, more employment opportunities is the automation and robotics industry in manufacturing. In early days, many worried that the introduction of robots and automated systems.
Yeah,
Yeah. So these industries like the manufacturing, electronics, and consumer goods. However, over time, it became clear that there were jobs lost, but there were also job shifts that happened, and it created new roles in requiring different sets of skills. So while automation did reduce the need for manual repetitive tasks, it also created demand for new roles such as robot technicians, software engineers, and data analysts, and so on and on, including what had happened with the coming of the gig economy. And I really feel that, but I am also very curious because ecosystems change when technology is also introduced. So that's why this topic that we have now is very, very relevant to many of our rooms here in Clubhouse, and I'm sure to the audience that we have. So I would like to introduce our guest speakers. Um, Omar Ahmed is a PhD candidate in mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. His primary research focus is the design of advanced models and control strategies for powertrain systems. In parallel, he also studies the EV transition's effect on the U.S. auto manufacturing labor. Omar earned his undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering at the University of Minnesota, where he conducted experiments on alternative fuels for engines. Andrew Weng is the EV Center postdoc fellow at the University of Michigan and program director of the Battery Talent Census at Volta Foundation. Before that, he spent a decade at Tesla, where he led projects on battery performance evaluation, systems modeling, and in-house battery cell development. His current research aims to accelerate the adoption of advanced battery manufacturing technologies. His technical training blends elements from dynamic systems modeling, control theory, electrochemical engineering, computer science, and materials characterization. So, without further ado, I bring to you our guest speakers, Dr. Andrew Weng and Dr. Omar Amit. So, welcome to Quantum Photonics, Andrew and Omar.
Cecile, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here this evening. It's 10 p.m. Eastern Time for me, and this is my first time on this forum. I'm so excited to share the research, and I hope you'll stay for the talk. I think I think you're probably here because you want to know the details about our study, and for the next 30 minutes, we're going to dive into some of the numbers that we've shared in our publication that I think Cecile has shared with all of you. I want to give a brief introduction to why why is Omar and myself working on this project, and I think maybe starting with myself, both of our research, Omar and myself, our main research is not in labor statistics. But I think over the course of the last 1 or 2 years, we've both found this topic extremely important. Um, you know, our advisor, Anna Stefanopoulou, she runs a group called the Powertrain Control Lab. And historically, we've done research in both combustion engines and electric vehicles more recently. So I started my PhD work with Anna studying battery modeling. And for Omar, I think Omar, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you are the last student in her group that is going to be graduating with a PhD in engine controls. Is that right?
So far, I'm the last. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the end of an era, at least for Anna's group, and I think it's somehow fitting that Omar and I kind of found each other and started this work together a few years ago. I also wanted to share a personal story. As Cecile mentioned, I have spent some time working at Tesla, and you know, before we started mass producing electric vehicles, working on the technical projects, it was a really fun engineering challenge, but it really didn't hit home what our work meant. 2017, which was the year Tesla started to build the world's first gigafactory located in Reno, Nevada. And I remember a bunch of us were summoned to work at the factory for about a month to work with the line operators, with the people who work there, 12-hour days, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And it really dawned on me in 2017 how much the work that we're doing affects people, like everyday people that are working on the lines. Reno, for those who have been to Reno, Nevada, Reno used to be known as a casino town. And it's close to Lake Tahoe, so people would go to Lake Tahoe to go skiing and then go to Reno, for the casinos. If you go to Reno now, I think you'll see it's very different, and there's so many people that are now working at the Tesla Panasonic plant. This is the battery manufacturing plant, and when I was working there, I remember talking to line operators who used to deal cards at the casino, right? There were people who used to work in paint, and they found themselves in new jobs at the production line. And ever since that experience, it really kind of um, it really left an impression on me that the work that we do as engineers really they affect people's lives. And I live in Michigan now, and of course there's so many conversations about vehicle electrification and what that means for the future of automotive jobs. So I think I've said enough as a preamble. Let's get into the main slides. So I'm going to go on slide 2 now, and we're going to start talking through some headlines that you probably have read at least one of them in the last couple of years. So starting a few years ago, there have been more and more discussions about electric vehicle jobs. And slide 2 shows 2 articles, Associated Press, the future of electric vehicle looms over negotiations in the U.S. auto workers strike. Jim Farley and other auto execs have said that because EVs have fewer moving parts, they will require 30% to 40% fewer workers to assemble than gas vehicles. And these headlines go on, right? Business Insider on the right also quotes Jim Farley, and the number ranges between 30 and 40%. And even 2 days ago, I was listening to the Michigan Senate debate between the Democratic and Republican senator candidates, and I believe the Republican candidate also quoted this number. So like these numbers are still making their way into the public discourse today. And the question is, where does that number come from? If you go to slide 3 in the deck, you'll see even more headlines, and you can see that this 30% number is starting to get passed around, even in institutions like the Economic Policy Institute. They're starting to quote this number of 30%. So the question is, where did this number come from? And when Omar and I started investigating this issue, we think that this number, it really stemmed from a company update from Jim Hackett. So take a look at the top right of that slide. I'm on slide 3, and this picture is, we took it out of a public slideshow presentation as part of the October 2017 CEO Strategic Update. So 2017, this was 7 years ago, almost on the dot. And looking at the slide carefully, what you see is a comparison of the factory footprint, comparing between battery electric vehicles on the left and the future electric vehicle on the right. The title of the slide is BEV product simplification yields floor space and capital efficiencies. And one of the bullet points, the third one on the bottom, says 30% reduction in hours per unit. So as far as we know, this number 30% started in 2017, and since then it's just being kind of ping-ponged around the different news outlets. It's getting picked up by the media, and it really, when Omar and I, we've been working in the same lab for a couple years now, and every time we read a new article about this, we ask each other, okay, where did this come from, and can we really do a better job of understanding the veracity of this number? And so that's really how we started this work. Turning to slide 4, let's ask the question, if this is true, okay, if EVs will cause a 30% decrease in the hours per unit, or the labor intensity, if this is true, what does this mean? And to answer this question, let's look at some numbers from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. In 2022, there were 830,000 auto manufacturing jobs in the U.S. 550,000 of them are in parts manufacturing, and 280,000 are in vehicle assembly. And if you take 30% of this total number, that implies a loss of almost 250,000 jobs across the board. And this possibility of job loss is not theoretical, but it's already been experienced in the past. For example, take a look at the plot on the right of that slide. Look at that dip in 2008. In the y-axis here is the U.S. auto manufacturing workers on the left axis. Take a look at 2008. What happened? Well, what happened was the 2008 global recession. And during this time, the U.S. auto sector lost about 23% of all jobs. So 1 in 5 jobs were lost. And people lived through this. And of course, when they read headlines about this today, it resonates with them. It's very visceral, and I think it's very understandable why there's this worry. You might also notice the secondary y-axis here is all U.S. manufacturing workers in millions on the right. And in 2008, during the recession, across all manufacturing sectors, the employment was down 12% compared to 23% for the auto industry. And that suggests that the auto sector is particularly vulnerable to economic downturns. Okay, so what I think is that what's happening is that today's auto workers bear the scar of the 2008 recession, and they are rightfully concerned about the job loss potential of the EV transition. But the question we have to answer now is this true, right? Is this number true? So let's look at the next slide. I'm on slide 5 now. And in this slide, we are looking at existing literature on what other institutions have done to try to clarify this 30% number. So we're not the first group to ask this question about where this number came from, and can we have a more quantitative and rigorous way to understand the effect of the EV transition on the labor force. So we have an example from the Boston Consulting Group. They did a study and showed that EVs require 1% less labor than ICE EVs. There was another great study done by Turner Cotterman, who I believe now works at McKinsey, and he published a scientific paper, and he found that EVs can require twice as much labor as ICE EVs if battery cell manufacturing is included. The third line shows a study from the Economic Policy Institute, and I quote, paraphrasing here from their study, by 2030, auto manufacturing sector could lose 75,000 jobs or gain 150,000 jobs, depending on domestic EV policies. And these policies are specific to where, mostly about where the parts manufacturing, specifically the battery manufacturing, happens. So if battery manufacturing happens domestically, then they project a job gain. If not, they project a job loss. And we're going to talk about the battery manufacturing at the end of this slide, but let's keep going for now. All right, so what we found when Omar and I did this study is, what is a common thread across all of these studies is that they all mostly use what I call a bottom-up approach to model labor intensity and use expert interviews. Like, for example, some of the work done by Cotterman has cited this very popular academic model of manufacturing labor intensity. It's called the backpack model, and it originates from Argonne National Lab. So the bottom line is that many of these literature, they rely on technical economic models driven by modeling assumptions and industry insider opinions. Turning to the next slide, we're now talking about, okay, how are we going to do something different and hopefully learn something new? And when Omar and I started this study, the insight that we had was, let's take a top-down approach and let's focus on existing historic data that's already out there. Battery electric vehicles have already been, they're already being made in the US, and it's been over a decade since Tesla started production in California. So let's look at the data, on the ground, so to speak, and see what this data tells us. And our approach is a departure from, what the literature has done so far, which again focused on using models, right? So to repeat, like we just want to describe what's happening in the industry right now, and we're going to do that by using publicly available data sources. The plot of the US that you see on the left shows an example of some of the data that you can find. Like you can go yourself and you can get this data. The, the color scale going from darker and darker shades of blue shows the number of auto assembly workers in the US, and you can see that it's mostly concentrated in Michigan and California. And this data comes from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics and the United States Census Bureau. We'll talk more about the technical details, but this data set, right, it basically gives you county level resolution of employment numbers categorized by the so-called North American Industry Classification Systems, or I think different people pronounce it differently, but I call it NICS code, and 3361 corresponds to automotive employment. So this data is available online and you can get it yourself. For the vehicle production data, this is about how many vehicles were made, right? And for this data source, we used Automotive News Research Data Center. And this is a subscription-based access to this database that includes vehicle production numbers sorted by manufacturer make, vehicle make, and site location. So unfortunately, this is a subscription service, and at the University of Michigan, we do have access to this, but I believe anyone can go to the website and request for that data, but they have to pay a subscription fee. And to summarize, we're able to find information about labor intensity, right, which is essentially the ratio of workers divided by vehicles using publicly accessible data like shown here. Going to the next slide, I'm on slide number 7 now. This is the next key part of our methods that we presented in this work. I think in every study that you read, right, when you read a paper, there's always like a trick or two that the authors do that make things work out. And sometimes it's hard to figure out what that trick is because usually, they don't write about it. Well, in this work, the trick that we did was, it's shown on this slide actually. And what we did was we made some intentional decisions to filter for specific locations that we want to focus our study on. So this is about identifying quote unquote apples to apples comparisons. And we're calling these transition plans. So why do we do this? Well, it turns out that even if you have publicly available data on employment and vehicle production, it's not so easy, right? And it's not so easy to synthesize the information together. Why? Well, it's partly because the resolution level of the data is different. For example, the employment data is given at the county level. So you cannot find employment data publicly for any particular manufacturer. You're just not going to find it. So all you have to go on is employment data at the county level. On the other hand, the vehicle production data is resolved by location and manufacturer from the automotive news database. And so we're lucky to have that. And so, imagine if you were doing this study, the first thing you might try is just, take every county in the US and somehow like take that data, figure out the number of employees in that county under NICS code 3361, which is automotive employment, divide that by the number of vehicles in that county. What does that give you? And we tried that actually in earlier iterations of the work, and it was just a bunch of muddy results, and we couldn't really learn anything. And so, this slide 7, it shows what we did differently to make the data show us useful information. And what we did was identify transition plans. What is a transition plan? These are specific manufacturing locations in the US that satisfy 3 criteria. The first is that this plant must have been making 100% electric vehicles for more than 2 years. Okay, and this filters out newer plants that have just gotten started. For example, Lucid Motors is another plant that was not included in this study. And I think it was because in 2022, which was the time period that this study ended at, in 2022, Lucid, I think, produced like 8,000 vehicles per year. And we, because of that, we didn't include that in this study. The second criteria is that, let me just talk about. So the second criteria is that the plant must have made non-trivial EV output. So it must have been producing vehicles for some time and not in not such a small quantity. And finally, there must have not been any other major source of auto assembly within the same US county. And again, this is because our data is limited by the county level resolution of the employment numbers. So if there were multiple vehicle manufacturers, right, in the same county, it would interfere with our ability to resolve what's going on at any particular plant. The figure on the bottom shows a conceptual illustration of how we're thinking about transitioning, right? So these are transition plants that used to make combustion engine vehicles, right? And they have since transitioned to fully making battery electric vehicles, right? And we found three, right? The first one, so these three plants are highlighted in the slide in a red, and the first one's Alameda, okay, Alameda County in the Bay Area in California. This is the site of the Fremont Tesla factory, right? The second plant we found is McLean County in Illinois, and this is currently the site of the Rivian factory. The third plant we found is in our state, Oakland County, Michigan, and Oakland is home to the Orion car assembly plant, and this one is owned by General Motors. Okay, so takeaway for this slide is, we developed a method to make the information useful for us. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. This is the last method slide. We have to talk about metrics, right? And what do we mean by labor intensity? We chose this metric to represent a normalized way to talk about workers, right? Because obviously, if you make more cars, you need more workers, right? So we need to normalize this idea of how many people it takes to make a car. And the definition we use is workers per vehicle. And it's essentially how many workers did it take to produce 1,000 vehicles each year. So on the numerator is the workers, and that's from, again, it's from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the denominator is the vehicles, which is coming from the Automotive News data set. And the 1,000, that number is just thrown in there to make the WPV number look slightly larger. Otherwise, it'll be like 0.05 or something. So it's just to make that number look nicer. So WPV, workers per vehicle, how many workers did it take to produce 1,000 vehicles each year? And this is the metric by which we will study and compare the labor intensity before and after the electric vehicle transition at the three transition plants that we have identified. Alameda, right? Alameda, McLean, and Oakland. So I want to pause here briefly because this concludes the methods part of our discussion. And Omar, do you want to like add anything here? I think I actually meant for this to be more of a discussion between me and Omar, but yeah, this is a good time to pause. And Omar, if you want to add any clarifications to anything I said.
Thanks, Andrew. I think you've covered everything that matters. I think the important thing before we get into the really interesting stuff of the results is to just emphasize that what we're really doing here is using data that anyone can access. Andrew mentioned that the Automotive News Research and Data Center, which we listed on slide 6. That is behind the paywall. It's a subscription service, but it's still data that isn't, it's not like insider data. It's not anything that's proprietary. We're using numbers that can be accessed by anyone, anywhere. And what's really novel about our work is not so much that we're using stats that are private or internal, but rather we're taking these public databases and we're looking at them in a new way. We're finding these hidden insights by examining these transition plants in a way that hasn't been done before. So the novelty is that we can take these databases that anyone can also do this work with, and it's just a matter of identifying this new area to look at and study in depth. that's really what we're excited to present here. And so I think that's pretty much the only other thing I'll add here before we get into the results.
Great, thanks, Omar. Let's jump into it. Slides 9, slide 10, and slide 11. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking through each one to give a historical context about each factory and what the main takeaways are from each transition plan. So let's start with slide 9, Alameda, California. Right? This is the Bay Area. Fremont is on the other side of the bay, as they say. And Fremont is historically the home to NUMMI. NUMMI stands for the New United Motors Manufacturing Incorporated. It's a joint venture between General Motors and Toyota. The panel A shows the y-axis is vehicle production quantity, and the x-axis is in years. So you can see, this is a site of a historic manufacturing plant for combustion vehicles. They made cars like the Toyota Corolla, Toyota Tacoma, and other vehicle models. Yeah, lots of great, literature on this historic venture between a Japanese manufacturing company and a historic US-based company, General Motors. And so what happened here is that during the global recession of 2008, there were, due to financial pressures and other pressures, the joint venture actually broke, and Toyota left the partnership, and the plant was soon closed. So this plant closed in around 2010. Shortly after that, there's a new company in the Bay Area, Tesla Motors, as they were called at the time. Tesla purchased the plant and retooled the lines to make first the Tesla Model S in about 2012, followed by the Model X, and followed by the Model 3 and Model Y. And so that's a brief history of this site. I want to introduce the plots on the right, panels B, C, and D. These are the same panels that you'll see in the upcoming slides, okay? So B, C, D. B is vehicles, vehicle productivity, right? This is vehicles made per year. C is the workers, right? So again, B is vehicles, and B comes from the automotive database. C is workers, and that comes from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And D is where we want to focus on, because D is labor intensity, defined, right, as workers per 1,000 vehicles, WPV. And a couple of callouts, okay? You know, during the NUMMI ownership, the peak productivity happened around, 2016. Oh, sorry, that's a typo actually. It's 2006 peak productivity in NUMMI. In 2006, NUMMI was producing more than 400,000 cars per year, okay, at its peak. And since then, Tesla has exceeded that number. So they're making more cars per year than NUMMI had at their peak. Looking at the workers, Tesla's has now is employing about 25,000 workers, and they've been hiring at around a rate of 2,500 workers per year since around 2013. But I think the number that we want to focus on is the bottom right, which is the labor intensity. And the takeaway here is that, well, during production ramp up, there is an increase in workers per 1,000 vehicles. And this was happening especially during the ramp up of Tesla Model S and X. And then over time, the labor intensity decreases and reaches somewhat of a steady state by 2018. And so then the callouts, if you're looking at panel D, it's comparing the labor intensity during the two peak productivity years, comparing between NUMMI and Tesla. And these numbers are 16 and 46. And so the big takeaway in this slide is that even after a decade of EV production in this site, the labor intensity has remained 3 times higher compared to the previous value from the NUMMI plant when they were making combustion vehicles. The last thing I want to explain about this slide is the purple line. So the purple line on the bottom right, that is the US average labor intensity. So this is averaging all automotive workers, assembly workers, and all vehicle production in the US. And because the US is still primarily making combustion engines as of 2022, less than 10% of all new vehicles were electric. This purple line roughly represents a baseline labor intensity averaged over all US, which is basically combustion engine. Okay, so that gap, that gap between the purple and the blue, it indicates that at least for this site, labor intensity remained 3 times higher after a decade of electric vehicle production. I'm going to turn to the next slide in McLean, Illinois. Again, this McLean County, the city is called Normal, Illinois. And if you go there today, you're going to see a factory, and Rivian owns this factory now. But it used to be owned by Mitsubishi. And Mitsubishi made cars, including the Mitsubishi Outlander, the Galant, the Eclipse, Endeavor, and other models. So this is a site of historic site of combustion engine vehicle production. And what happened in 2017 was that Mitsubishi faced economic pressures and they decided to leave. They left the US market, the automotive market, and they shut that plant down. So that plant was shut down in around 2017, and then a few years later was purchased by Rivian, and they started to retool those lines to start making their R1S and R1T. The plots on the right, again, show vehicles, workers. You can get a sense of how many workers were working there before and after this transition. And then the bottom right plot shows labor intensity. So just going quickly through this result, the takeaway here is that we have an example in McLean of a new EV startup, right? So with Rivian, they've been around for many years now, but I think based on their vehicle production volumes, right, and their profit margins, right, they're still very much in startup mode, and in this startup mode, we are seeing that there's more than a 10 times labor intensity increase during the startup phase. And this result is roughly consistent with what we saw in the previous slide, where Tesla was also, it took Tesla a long time, right, to bring that labor intensity down over time. And there's reasons why that is that we're going to discuss after this section, but you can speculate on the reasons, and we're going to talk about that. But the data shows that during the first at least 5 years of EV production, the labor intensity is significantly higher than the previous baseline from combustion engines. All right, I'm going to turn to the next slide, which is our last transition plant. This one's in Oakland, Michigan, Oakland County, Michigan. The plant that we're talking about, specifically the Orion, this is the Orion vehicle assembly plant. And this plant, it's not like the others in which there was a change in ownership. This plant has been owned by General Motors this whole time. And what changed was that in 2000, I think roughly 2017, 2016, they started producing the Chevy Bolt. And by 2020, that plant was producing exclusively the Chevy Bolt. So this is an example of a plant in which they were gradually transitioning their assembly lines from making combustion vehicles like the Chevy Sonic, like the Buick Verano, Chevy Malibu, Pontiac G6. They were gradually converting these lines over until all of the lines were making Chevy Bolts. And you can see the numbers on the right show the trends. Generally speaking, like in this particular plant, the vehicle and the workers were both decreasing. And in fact, I think they're actually closed as of today, and they're retooling it to produce the next generation General Motors electric vehicles. But the data that we have to work with for this study is the data in 2020, 2021, and 2022. And this data it corresponds to a signal that we have for electric vehicle labor intensity. So that's shown on the bottom right. And the takeaway here is that this labor intensity for the Chevy Bolt in 2022, it's actually it's higher compared to when GM was at its peak productivity when they were making combustion vehicles in 2013. And it's also tracking the US average, which is in purple. So even in this case of the Oakland plant, we're not seeing the 30% decrease in labor intensity, right? If 30% labor intensity decrease was true, then the blue line would be going down by roughly 30%, but instead it's actually trending up. Turning to slide 12, I just want to re-summarize what we've learned. And I think there's a lot of interesting features in these graphs that you're welcome to study. But if there's one takeaway from this work so far is that at every single transition plant that we studied, labor intensity has increased. So in Alameda, when NUMMI transitioned to Tesla, labor intensity went from 16 to 46 workers per vehicle. In Oakland, this number went from 17 to 31, and in McLean County, it went from 18 to 316. So that summarizes the main results that we tried to present in the paper that was published. It's focused on studying labor intensity at these 3 transition plants. And I want to pause again here and, Omar, let's maybe we can add some nuance and caveats before we go to the next section.
Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, 3 plants. On slide 12, you can see the summary of us taking all of our analysis and distilling it into the key components of the vehicle production output, the workers employed year by year, and then this workers per 1,000 vehicles metric that we use as a basis for this before versus after comparative analysis. What I'll just highlight is that with our study, we can offer these 3 pretty interesting case studies. None of them are totally similar to the other. Each of them has interesting historical context, different geographical elements, different histories of ownership, and different approaches to making EVs. And so there's a lot to unpack when we really get into the details of what each of these sites mean. And that's part of why this study, in my opinion, is so interesting. We will get more into our explanations for why we're seeing what we're seeing in the next portion of the slides. But just to kind of preface that, what the counter arguments or the discussion points that people have raised as we've gone around putting together this work and presenting this work, it's interesting because there's no single counter argument that can apply to all 3 of these pieces of analysis. Every plant has something interesting that can stand on its own as an interesting case example of what we're seeing and why we're seeing it. So there's a lot to unpack with each of them. For now, if you see slide 12, that's the summary of where we're at. That at each of them, we see this increase in this per vehicle workforce or labor intensity, which is directly counter to what the widely accepted notion is. So yeah, let's get into why we're seeing what we're seeing, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Omar. Yeah, no, thanks for mentioning that piece of the puzzle where, yeah, every site is very unique with its own distinct history and time in place for their role in the EV transition. I want to highlight also, this is a small detail, but if you're looking at the slide 12 right now, you might wonder what's up with the dots and the lines and the workers plot. I'm talking about the second row. In the workers, there's dots and lines, right? And I just want to clarify one thing. For the workers data, we triangulated information from the US Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we also looked at news articles. We Google searched a bunch of news articles, and for some of these sites, labor and employment have been well documented over time. And that was especially true in the McLean plant in Rivian's case, and in Tesla's case in Alameda, right? These two companies are in the news all the time. So the dots are from the news articles, and the solid line is from the government data. And where available, we put both of these data sets on top of each other, and that just kind of bolsters our confidence that the data set that we're looking at is trustworthy, and that when we have information from different sources, they're corroborating each other. So just wanted to mention that because you might be wondering why. Sometimes there's dots and sometimes there's lines. Okay, let's move on to the next section. And I think this is probably the most important part of this whole talk, right? And to summarize where we're at, I hope that we've been persuasive in showing that at these assembly plants in the US, we're seeing higher labor intensity across the board when these plants transition from combustion engine to electric vehicle assembly, all right? The question is why? And in our publication, we proposed three possible reasons for this that we're going to just briefly discuss here. And we invite you, the listener, to pitch your own ideas, because I really think this is important for us to all understand. And a lot of this is still, we're still investigating it, and I think there's still a lot more work to be done to really understand what's happening in terms of the why question. So for now, let's talk about what we've discussed in the paper. And there are three things. First, higher vehicle complexity of premium EVs. Second, investment in manufacturing R&D, and then vertical integration. So we think these are three major factors, three major contributors to labor intensity being higher for EVs. And let's talk about the first one in slide 14. So here we're talking about vehicle complexity, right? And what are we talking about here? We're talking about the fact that when automotive manufacturers release their first electric vehicle, right? Especially, new automakers like Rivian and Tesla, they tend to be luxury cars, right? The Model S, the Tesla Model S and Model 3, right? Model S was, a premium electric vehicle sedan, and Model 3 it's much more affordable, but I think the MSRP is still tends to be on the higher side, especially the higher trims. And this is certainly the case for the Rivian R1S and R1T, right? They're great vehicles, but you have to pay a lot for them. So the plots are shown on the bottom. They show the MSRP, so this is the sticker price in 2023 dollars. So this is like inflation adjusted numbers. And this just goes to show that if you look at the combustion models, they tend to be uh, they tend to have a lower MSRP, and we believe this could be an indicator for the complexity of the vehicle in the sense that luxury vehicles will probably take more labor to build, and that's our hypothesis. But it's also interesting if you look at the Oakland case. Oakland has the smallest difference in price. The Chevy Bolt is priced at around the same, it's the same price point as some of their other vehicle offerings, about $40,000. And Oakland, if you recall the previous result, Oakland also had the smallest difference in labor intensity. So I think this is kind of a data point on the other side that says like it might be confirming this idea that maybe the labor intensity is actually just a function of how premium the car is, and maybe over time when Tesla and Rivian make more and more cars, that this labor intensity will sort of converge towards um, the value, the previous labor intensity value that we saw in combustion cars. Let me talk about slide 15. Slide 15 is a note about investment in manufacturing R&D. So of course, these are new technologies. These are new powertrains, electric vehicle motors, batteries, battery packs, power electronics. I think all of these require more investment in an engineering workforce technology development, and we think this could maybe explain some of the increase in labor, specifically increasing the number of workers that are in these factories as they iron out the kinks of these technology. What data do we have? Well, we don't have a lot of data, but the plot on the right shows assembly worker monthly pay. So this is from government data, and it's comparing the pay between Oakland, Michigan, and Alameda, California, where if you recall, the labor intensity in California is much higher, right, compared to Oakland. And what we're also seeing is that the monthly pay is started to kind of shoot up at around the time when the company was mass producing, started to mass produce the Tesla Model 3. And engineering occupations also comprise, 7% of assembly workers in California, but only 3% in Michigan. So, if you kind of read between the lines, between the percent of assembly workers and the monthly pay, uh, maybe what this is saying is that it's suggesting that maybe there's just more engineering workforce, and there's just more work to be done in the engineering front that's causing more workers and higher labor intensity. The last element, and might be the most important one, is vertical integration. And I'm on slide 16 now. And the question we're trying to ask here is how much of the car and its parts are actually made in the assembly plant? And how might this change with the electric vehicle transition? The table on the left summarizes, based on our investigation, this is our belief of what is happening in each of the three plants we've studied. Um, in terms of what can happen, there's vehicle assembly. Of course, I mean, vehicle assembly has to happen in all these plants because they're making cars. But there's also battery pack assembly and cell manufacturing. And what we found is that in all three cases, of course, vehicle assembly happened in all three transition plants. None of the three plants included cell manufacturing. Okay, the gray area is in the battery packs. And in this case, each plant did something different. In the case of Alameda, um, our investigations showed that Alameda, I'm talking about the Fremont Tesla plant, they were making battery modules and battery packs for the Model S and the Model X on site in Fremont factory. And this is publicly available information. However, when they started making Model 3 and Model Y, the more mass production cars, production of battery packs shifted to the Reno, Nevada plant. This is also publicly available information. Okay, and let's contrast that to Oakland. So in Oakland's case, pack assembly was taking place elsewhere. And in McLean, in the case of Rivian, Rivian's labor intensity does include pack assembly, we believe. Okay, and I think there's one important takeaway here, which is that Oakland, right? We're talking about the GM plant that made the Chevy Bolt. Oakland has no pack assembly or cell manufacturing, yet labor intensity there still increased. Um, So I'm going to pause here because I think Omar might want to chime in here about all of the three factors that we discussed. But before passing the mic to Omar, I will just say, yeah, this is kind of, I think, the meat of the issue that we're all trying to understand together. And I think vertical integration, right? It's all about where the boundaries are. How are we drawing the boundaries of the factory? And in the next slides, we're going to talk about parts manufacturing. But let's get there after we talk with Omar a little bit.
Yeah, so this is now that we've gotten through our reasoning for why we're seeing this higher labor intensity, we can kind of go back to what I was saying earlier about how all of our cases present some interesting examples. So Tesla and Rivian are arguably the two most well-known of our case studies. They're the flashy ones, the big startups that are trying something totally new and disruptive. And so it's tempting to say that, okay, fine, you're seeing higher labor intensity, but it's just because these guys are new players. They have a lot to figure out and they have a lot of really demanding innovation cycles to have to work through in order to produce cars. And that's a fair point, but then that's why we have our third case study that we can leverage here in this discussion, which is the Oakland County plant that was making the GM Bolt. So in my opinion, as I've worked on this research, I've come to realize that Oakland is actually the most interesting out of our three case studies. And this is what I tell people everywhere I go to give this talk, is that Oakland's the one you really want to pay attention to. This is an established OEM with decades of car making experience. They didn't do an abrupt switch in the type of car they were making, like you could argue Tesla or Rivian did, taking ownership of those plants. Instead, GM did a gradual ramp up of the Chevy Bolt at the same time as production of the Chevy Sonic and Buick Verano and other ICE cars continued. And you can see that production history in full on slide 11 for reference. This is a gradual ramp up of the Chevy Bolt. And then as the Chevy Bolt continued to increase in production, they gradually streamlined and eventually totally declined their ICE vehicles. So this is a company that has experienced and, for lack of a better phrase, did everything right. They did everything in the most responsible way possible when it comes to trying to take an existing factory and start making a new type of technology in that factory. And what we're seeing is that they still saw this increase in labor intensity. The discussion that Andrew had about vertical integration just now also makes that point interesting. You could say that Tesla and Rivian are doing more of the are making more parts associated with the car under the same roof because they're doing some of the battery pack assembly. Well, in with the Chevy Bolt, all the pack assembly was done in a facility about half an hour away, and a completed battery pack was being brought into this Oakland facility to be put into the Chevy Bolt in a manner very, very similar to how completely assembled engines were being brought in to the Oakland plant in order to make the Chevy Sonic and the Buick Verano, etc. So the Chevy Bolt, if this 30% reduction in labor were to be true, the Chevy Bolt case, the Oakland County plant, would be the plant in the US at least that would show that number. What I mean is that this plant has everything going for it in terms of executing a transition to electric vehicle manufacturing in the most responsible, efficient way possible. And what we're seeing is that they still saw this increase in labor intensity. And if you look at panel D on slide 11, what's really fascinating is that the Oakland plant's labor intensity in blue on panel D lines up pretty much exactly with the macro level US trend that we see in that dashed purple. So maybe it's not so much to say that because they switched to the Chevy Bolt, they saw an increase in labor intensity, but rather that whatever simplifications the Chevy Bolt's platform was supposed to offer, being an electric vehicle powertrain, it wasn't enough for these guys to buck away from the macro level trend that we were seeing in the broader automotive industry. And so, for all these reasons, I think our diverse uh, array of case studies is a really, really fascinating and compelling um, examination of EV manufacturing workforce trends. And so, what we're setting up for now is a bigger discussion of where do we go from here? What's there? What else is there to look at? What we've shown you up to this point is just the assembly plants. So this is sort of the trade-off that we had to make. We really wanted to look at a historical approach using data that anyone could access, as Andrew and I have set up earlier in this talk. And in doing it, in order to do that, one of the trade-offs was to kind of limit the scope of the manufacturing chain that we looked at. So we really were just looking at, in a way, the final step, that vehicle assembly plant, where the thing coming out of the plant is a completed drivable car. There's so much more to this study, though, to the story, if you start to look more upstream and even downstream of that process. So let's close with getting into that, Andrew.
Yeah, yeah. What a great transition, Omar. We're on slide 17 now, everyone. We're almost done. Thanks for Cecile. I apologize. I think I'm running over time, but we only have two more slides left, so we'll try to end in the next 5 minutes, and then we can take some questions. And I mean, Omar said it right. it's like, we wanted to give the best perspective we could based on the data we had, and we really wanted to clarify what was going on in these vehicle assembly plants, right? And and where do we go from here? And that's the question Omar asked. Where do we go from here? Well, I think we need to talk about parts manufacturing, right? Because if you look at Michigan, right, um, there's more parts jobs than there are assembly jobs, and we're talking about people who are making transmissions, combustion engines, and I think a very fair question is, what is going to happen to those jobs? And I think we need to do more work to answer that question. And so let's take a look at slide 18. Okay, and 18 is this is our uh, the plot on the right is actually in the supplemental information, because we think there's a lot more work that needs to be done here. But what we're talking about here is really uh, supply chain integration. So when we talk about the automotive workforce, the first thing we think about is the people who are making the cars, and then it's people who are making the parts. What is a part in an electric vehicle? I think this is a fundamentally confusing question because it is definitely true that electric vehicles have fewer mechanical moving parts, right? If you just look at um, transmissions, combustion engines, there's a lot of parts, physical parts. Well, what is that for batteries is not clear. And I think probably the most obvious thing you can think about is the battery, right? And the battery cell, these are individual cells that are strung together to make a battery pack. And the amount of labor that goes into battery pack manufacturing is really, I think, what we need to consider when we talk about uh, will there be jobs in the electric vehicle sector to replace the legacy jobs in transmission and combustion engine. So I think, I think the point that I'm trying to make is that we want to figure out like where to draw the line in the supply chain, right? And the more upstream you go, the more potential jobs you create, and probably the most head-to-head comparison you can make right now in parts manufacturing is between battery cell manufacturing and the combustion, the engine parts jobs. So let's look at slide 18 briefly. Um, the map on the left is from a study in 2022 that shows pr proposed battery factories. And this map, honestly, it's out of date now because the number of announcements on battery factories has been growing and also changing very quickly. But it's just to show you that there is a lot of battery assembly plants that are planned, if not already in operation, especially in Michigan and parts of the Carolinas, California, and other states. And the plot on the right, what is the plot on the right show? I think this is where we want to end. Okay, this is a comparison of the engine parts jobs. So this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and in total, there's 56,000 jobs in the US in 2022. That's in engine parts. So think about jobs. This is probably including transmission and combustion engine parts manufacturing. And we're comparing that to the battery manufacturing jobs, assuming 100% transition to electric vehicles and the data source. And I think the unsatisfying takeaway is that the comparison between engine parts jobs and battery manufacturing jobs, um, will there be more jobs or less? That depends on what you assume. And these numbers are coming from these kind of bottom-up analysis approaches that we cited earlier at the very beginning that we found doesn't always accurately reflect the reality of what's happening. And part of the challenge of this work is that there just isn't enough battery manufacturing jobs data out there for us to do a rigorous study in the same way we've done for the assembly jobs yet. For example, if you go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and you try to find a category for battery manufacturing, it's actually a little confusing today. And so I think that, over time, I think we'll learn more about it. But as of today, this is still a very challenging, question, and battery manufacturing jobs need more study. So um, the last slide is slide 19. Let me just summarize what we've talked about in this hour together. Okay, so we've looked at 3 US auto plants that have transitioned from making combustion cars to electric vehicles. For all 3 of these sites, we found that more workers per vehicle were needed, not fewer. The biggest takeaway, I think, from our work is that the rapid widespread loss of jobs, i.e., 30% less labor during the EV transition, we think this is a smaller risk than many fear. And we want to end with a suggestion to everyone that like we need to do more work. I think, Omar and I, we started this work because we think we found something that's like a question that's really important for us to answer as a research community. And I think we're just at the start of that process of really starting to develop methods and thinking about how we can add rigor into some of these claims and the data that I think is going to have important policy implications. And I think we need to do more, and future work here should focus on upstream EV manufacturing and possibly even downstream processes like recycling. The QR code is a link to our paper. I welcome you to reread it. I hope we've done a decent job summarizing some of the main takeaways from the work. And I want to give Omar the last word.
Hi, thanks, Andrew. Okay, yeah, I'll just echo what he said. We think we're onto something that we're proud of, but also is indicative of just how much work there is. Our study was just published a couple weeks ago, and we're we're busy trying to get the word out right now because we really want feedback from people. We really want to hear what their thoughts are and where we can go from here, what kind of work is needed, what types of additional investigations would help flesh out this area of study, and what practical day-to-day concerns people have in this space beyond just academic research. What we've gotten to realize from doing this work is that yes, there's a data analysis component, but there's also, real people's lives that are being affected by these technology transitions. And so it really matters that we get the factual information right, we present it in a responsible way, and that we identify how to keep moving forward in a way that continues to shed light on what's really happening and to cut through whatever numbers or figures get thrown around without much to support them. And that's why we're here. That's the spirit of why we're trying to get the word out on this work by participating in venues such as this. So we really thank the group for having us. We really thank all of you for your time. And yeah, we welcome whatever feedback, whatever questions you have on this work. And we're happy to clarify anything as well along the way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew and Omar. So, thanks for the very succinct presentation, and I would like to congratulate you for that paper because when we first started to communicate with each other about this, I thought that this has a lot of implications, and you are just throwing a stone there, but you are looking at the ecosystem that you have investigated. But on my side, being in the industry myself, I also looked at my ecosystem, the supply chain, and the effects that's happening because every ecosystem has its own supply chain and distribution as well. So it has a great implication about policy planning and sociology. So many implications everywhere. So yeah, I would like to congratulate you for the talk, and I hope you go further because it is very relevant. So it has been quite some time that I haven't seen Chris here in Clubhouse, and also Ryan, who is one of our regular moderators here in Quantum Photonics. And I would like to welcome them. I'm very glad that you are here. And on stage, I'd like to welcome Kevin as well and Jay. So there are questions on the room chat. And yeah, if there's time, we will read it later because these are very important questions. So if any one of you on stage would like to speak, of course, we will go in PTR order. So I'd like to ask if Chris would like to speak now, then after that, Ryan, and yeah, the others.
I actually think Ryan should go next because he's actually worked in this space with in some of the factories. I'd love to hear his perspective.
Oh yeah, thank you, Chris. So I grew up in Michigan and I spent 12 years after college and I counted over 10,000 automotive suppliers and all the final assembly, the engine plants. So I really like the presentation. It's a great job, and I think I've heard this conversation since they started talking about electric vehicles, and the I guess the breaking point in the conversation becomes that supplier conversation is because if you look at an internal combustion engine and the amount of parts required to assemble one of those, they're pretty dependent on those tier one, two, and even three suppliers in the supply chain. So there's a lot of small to medium-sized businesses in Michigan that might make one of those few hundreds of parts that might make up a transmission or the overall final assembly component. So that's what I think is going to be tough. Is I think how do you account and identify all those smaller suppliers providing those sub-assembly components and how those are impacted versus completely eliminating there's fewer components in an electric assembly and there's going to be fewer suppliers there. So I think this might focus on the final assembly plant, which I think that yeah, that depending how they engineer it and how much they automate, they could increase their labor force there. But I think the whole supply chain, I'm wondering how you're accounting for that, or how deep have you gone down the supply chain there?
Yeah, it's a good question. As you said it yourself, this is the question that really, really matters when you get to it. Before we get to the parts discussion, I will say Andrew presented, you can see it on slide 3, what this, to the best of our knowledge, this original source of this statistic, 30% less labored in EVs, where that really came from. And it was this slide from a CEO strategic update report from the then CEO of Ford, Jim Hackett. One of the reasons we focus on assembly plants is because the original context in which this 30% number was presented, and you can see it on the slide, on that slide, on slide 3, is they were presenting it in the context of assembly plants. So even just in the context of the final assembly plants, they were talking about a reduction in footprint and capital investment, and then 30% reduction in hours per unit. So our study is relevant to the original scenario in which this number that goes around quite a bit was presented. When it's sort of like a game of telephone, as the years have gone by and as different people have cited and propagated this 30 to 40% number, they've sort of lost that nuance and just sort of made it a blanket statement about electric vehicles will just in general require 30% fewer jobs without really thinking about or caring to get into the details of, well, where does that mean? Does it mean in the floor space of an assembly plant? Does it mean along the entire supply chain, et cetera? So a lot of that nuance has been lost. But yeah, I just want to note that our work is addressing the original context. Now, to get to your question, it's really, really tough to track it with analytical data. It's definitely hard to do it with the framework that we have because we're relying on government aggregated data that it's not meant to be assigned to individual companies. The reason that we're doing what we can do is because with the 3 transition plants we've identified, we can confirm using the vehicle production database from the Automotive News Research and Data Center that there's very little other automotive manufacturing activity happening in the counties that we identified. So even though the government employment data we're looking at is technically anonymous and meant to be this aggregated batch, we can reasonably conclude by cross-referencing it with the automotive news vehicle production data that it's still mostly, if not entirely, attributed to these in each county's single vehicle production sites. So doing this kind of analysis with the diverse decentralized ecosystem of parts manufacturing becomes a lot harder. And I don't know if a good way to do it using exactly the framework that we've used for our work. I think it to do so requires some combination of what we're doing along with studies that we cited on slide 5. So specifically, I would point to Turner Cotterman's work, who's I think before we came along was probably the definitive research attempt at really getting at this question along the entire manufacturing ecosystem. So, Andrew, if you have anything to jump in there, feel free.
Yeah, I'll just say this really quickly, Ryan. I appreciate your perspective, and um, I want to think of our work as moving the conversation down the supply chain. And I think for people like yourself, like you might think like, isn't this is obvious? Like we should have been talking about the supply, like the parts to begin with, and I think in the academic world, I think we want to move carefully and one step at a time. And I do think that, hopefully our work moves the conversation towards that more important question, I would say, about, supply. And I think though, we have to be really careful about drawing the boundaries of our comparison, right? Because I think if right now, I think there's a sense of comparing, you know, what is a EV factory, right? What do people talk about when they say EV factory? Is it the assembly plant or is it the battery plant? And I think we have to be really careful here. And one of the things I stress at the end is like I think the right comparison is between engine assembly, transmission assembly, and battery manufacturing. So, I hope that, the next step of this work is like we look more closely at what is going on with these battery plants because, if we want to talk about powertrain and the work and the labor that's needed to make the materials and assemble the materials, the powertrain is the batteries, and there's a whole range of job numbers that people are quoting. Um, and I will also just like let's use our intuition, right? Like I think if there's no battery manufacturing in the US, I find it hard to think that the the parts jobs are not at risk. To say it another way, I think there needs to be some considerable presence of battery manufacturing domestically for uh, a job, a job transition to potentially take place. Then the last thing I want to say is I think there's also a conversation that needs to be had beyond the number of jobs, but also the type of jobs, the quality of jobs, the what are you actually doing on your job, right? Like, and battery manufacturing looks quite different from combustion engine assembly. There's much less, mechanical assembly involved. There's much more. It's almost like closer to battery manufacturing. I think is closer to like an electronics assembly or semiconductor manufacturing than motors. So yeah, there's a lot of questions that I think we need to ask, and I think a lot of it's in the battery manufacturing space.
Do you mind if I chime in?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. Those are awesome responses. I appreciate you, both of you, being here tonight and your thoughts.
I think Kevin's next up on the PTR order. I just wanted to do a brief plug. There is an excellent battery hour we happen every week here in Clubhouse, and it's a very small Clubhouse community, but they do a really good job of inviting experts from different spaces, and they go deeply into the manufacturing expertise and how that works with things. And they'll show up at World Economic Forum events and be like, "Hey, we're on the sidelines, and here we'll educate some policy people on how this works, and let's do that on Clubhouse too." So if you do have a chance to connect with them, they're really good out here on the community here.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. We'd love to be connected.
Sweet. I'll take over to Kevin with things.
Yeah, thank you, Chris and Andrew. And yeah, Kevin, if you want to speak, just flash your mic. Or yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay. Yeah, I have some questions, but basically, I'll say from what I've heard, is that they have startups, with Elon Musk, so why were they working more efficiently? You say luxury vehicles, but perhaps because they're a startup as well, and you said their monthly pay was higher, so maybe that had incentives. Also Musk is very sort of demanding. Especially at first, is what I've heard. So there's some thoughts of. And then also, Fremont is in Silicon Valley, as you may know. I grew up in Fremont, and actually, it's at the border of a wealthier area as well. So it's in a specific area, and it's in California. They're more efficient, compared to Michigan. So there's some things I thought of. May speak on, and then so some questions maybe like I'm not sure if I heard the 2008 GM bankruptcy and Ford restructuring, if that plays into it. And then I'm personally interested in the role of government, support and incentives, for workers and industries, affected by the EV adoption, and then the incentives for consumers for the government. So I know that may be a lot of. Yeah, I may have a follow-up question after that. I think that's sort of a lot of stuff. If you have anything to say for that about that.
Yeah, Kevin, thanks for your questions. There were a lot, and I'm trying to figure out. Maybe I'll start with your comment about Tesla. So our data suggests Tesla was actually less efficient because our metric is labor intensity, and basically it took them more workers per vehicle, and compared to Numi, when they were making Toyota Corollas, and we attributed that decrease in efficiency partly to the fact that they were making luxury vehicles, partly because there's a lot of manufacturing R&D, and possibly because they like to vertically integrate, right? Like I think we know from headlines that Tesla tends to be a more vertically integrated company, so it means they might, that increase in workers at Fremont could reflect this idea that they might be, kind of incorporating some of would-be suppliers around the area. So these are speculative, but we're just kind of thinking about how to sort of understand why, after an entire decade of EV production, labor intensity remained 3 times higher, right? That was one of the main findings. So I hope that sort of at least adds some discussion points to the first part of your question, Kevin. But I also want to add maybe something a bit more philosophical about like what is the policy goal of this? Like if you get the data, what is the policy goal? And Omar and I are not policy people, but one thing we've discussed is like, is high labor intensity good, right? Because high labor intensity means low labor efficiency, right? And the limit of the best labor efficiency is 0 workers per vehicle, right? That's full automation, right? And I think maybe the policy goal is really to steer us towards that direction, but in a sustainable way. So it doesn't happen gradually. Maybe it happens, it's moderated so that we're making sure that the transition is seeing the outcomes of the communities and making sure we're doing that in a responsible way. So I don't know what the answer is there, but labor intensity and labor efficiency are just fundamentally, they're inverse of each other. And I think it highlights some really interesting questions that we haven't answered yet.
Thanks for the clearing that up. Yeah, then yeah, I don't know if the bankruptcy, the 2008, Great Recession, GMC bankruptcy and Ford restructuring, and then yeah, then the potential for EV related job creation in rural and disadvantaged areas. I'm wondering about Michigan. It's obviously some areas, and maybe comparison with international experiences. Like Europe and China with managing EV related job displacement. Some things I thought of, but there's I see lots of questions in the chat and lots of people on stage. So thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you,
those are.
Kevin.
Oh,
Omar,
sorry.
you were about to say something.
Okay, yeah, I'll just say quickly. So, the recession in 2008 and we is something we can actually see in our data when we look at the Oakland case. So if you look closely at slide 11, panel A has this production history by individual vehicle models. Our analysis is technically at county levels. It's just that, as I said earlier, these counties are home to only one specific plant. What we see in the Oakland County in Michigan is actually that before the recession, there was actually a couple other plants active. So in panel A of slide 11, we point out the Chevy Silverado, and then we make a note about how it was actually produced in a different plant, the Pontiac plant. So there were a couple of plants that shut down with the recession in 2010, and the only plant remaining in that county that resumed production post-recession was the Orion plant that went on to make the Chevy Bolt and is the focus of our analysis in that county. So this is one example of how, yeah, these financial disruptions, these companies' strategic restructuring can influence the automotive landscape. We saw it just recently with the fact that this same plant, the Orion plant that was making the Chevy Bolt, they discontinued the Bolt, and they have actually closed this plant as of the end of 2023 in order to renovate it for what they announced is production of electric pickup trucks. So I think the GMC Sierra, the Chevy Silverado, and then I think they announced that they plan to make a new version of the Chevy Bolt in some other plant elsewhere. I don't even think it's in Michigan anymore. And so they've been doing various announcements and shakeups to their plans as they've been going on. And so these types of decisions are going to keep happening, and they're going to keep happening not just in the vehicle production space, but also in the battery manufacturing space. So Andrew had pointed out on slide 18, we have this aggregated visual of various battery manufacturing announcements in the US, but as Andrew said, that's changing and that's going to continue to change. So a lot of this is in flux, and sort of also offering a philosophical point is how who is being taken into consideration when these announcements are made, right? And what we see, unfortunately, historically, is that the actual workers that are making these products often are not really at the top of that list of considerations. It's all purely strategic. It's all purely financial when it comes to the companies making these decisions. And I think that's why there's a lot of frustration from the automotive community. Not that we're members of that automotive labor community. We don't mean to speak too much on their behalf, but what we saw with the UAW negotiations and the strike last fall was that a lot of pent up frustration that led to that strike on such a large scale, and then consequent, really historic negotiations that incorporated for the first time battery manufacturing under that UAW umbrella, really signaling this desire to be included in this technological transition in a way that this community of automotive workers in the US hadn't previously expressed as much interest in being a part of. So I think it's just important to think about who is really being considered when making these types of decisions. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but perspective is really important. Going just beyond the academic research part, the factual analysis, there's important to keep in mind perspective on these types of discussions and examinations of these issues. It's very complex, but yeah, that's what I would advise to everyone listening.
Yeah, thank you, Omar. So, we have Jay here and Chavis on stage. And Chavis, we go in PTR order. Jay has been waiting for a long time, so I'd like to give the mic to him now. And after Jay, you can speak, Chavis. And I think Ryan has other comments and Chris as well. If there's time, Then we go back to you. So Jay, mic to you. Thank you for waiting.
Yeah, of course. It wasn't a real question I had, but I just wanted to say, I just came in the room randomly, but you guys had a great presentation, and I've been in the industry too. I was working for Lucid Motors for a couple of years up until recently, and I was working for a while, like on the factory plant in Casa Grande, Arizona. And there was a time where I was practically just living on that factory floor, and I'm in the software side. So, but I do see what you mean. There are so many jobs that have been just created, and just like just seeing that small town and just talking to the people there. I think the Lucid pretty much employs, I think, over 20-30% of all the people in the town. And I've just been seeing so many jobs just being created, and just these towns in the middle. Like I know, like Sparks. I think Sparks is where Tesla's gigafactory is. Just random towns in like Nevada and Arizona, and they're just being created in the field from these EV plants. So yeah, and I think that battery manufacturing jobs and all these, they create more skilled labor jobs mainly, and that's what I wanted to add. It's not just like any jobs; it's a lot of skilled jobs, which you know, I guess is a really good thing. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I really appreciate your perspective. And this gives me a chance to highlight that, just to reinforce what we were looking at for our study was the plants that used to have an ICE vehicle production history and then switched to EVs. So Lucid is a really interesting case for a totally different reason. It's not a transition plant as we've defined it, right? There was no previous
Yeah.
ICE vehicle history in that Casa Grande town. The Lucid built that plant from scratch. And so it's not applicable to the framework of our study. We're really interested in this comparative analysis to try to offer as close as we could to an apples to apples compare analysis that no one else had done. But for totally different reasons, plants like Lucid present really, really interesting opportunities for study to look at this sort of nothing's happening and now what is happening type of analysis in these towns. So Lucid is one example, their production plant in Casa Grande, Arizona, Tesla's new facility out in Texas, the Gigafactory in Nevada. Those are all examples of sort of new places cropping up out of nowhere and then presenting really interesting opportunities to look at that financial economic impact on the surrounding communities there, for sure.
Yeah, I want to offer a bit of nuance to this discussion because I think opportunity is not created uniformly. I'm talking about geography. So when you have new waves of investment in manufacturing, I think places like Sparks and it's happening in the Carolinas right now. There's a bunch of factories going up. I think there will be jobs created. I think it's another story to look at places that have historic presence in manufacturing, especially in Michigan, right, where there's so many parts manufacturing jobs, and I think it is important to sort of draw that distinction. I think because I think one area that's booming doesn't really do anything for the people that are not in that area. So I am excited about the opportunities, but I also uh, want to keep focusing on how we sort of navigate this transition, especially for um, the existing workforce. And I just want to also just yeah, Jay, thanks for being here. And it sounds like you dropped in at a good time, and I'm so happy that you're here. And it's great to hear from you and your experience at Lucid. And Kevin, I just want to say you asked about the role of government. So I'm going back to a question we didn't answer briefly, but you asked about the role of government in labor efficiency and things like that in the Tesla plant. And I just want to say I heard your question, but I don't have a response for you because I don't really know how to think about it right now. I think government could give some cash infusions to support the technology development, the production, the capital costs, and all that. I don't know to what extent that influences the labor productivity, though. That's the part I don't know. So Just wanted to tell you I heard you, but I don't have a great response for you.
Yeah, I think, government is really very important. So, of course, now in Asia, China is the leading manufacturer, and actually, they already have this ride hailing taxis, which can accommodate only three um, passengers, which are these driverless taxis. It has been going on the province of Wuhan for more than a year now, or almost 2 years. So you will see that, of course, their system of government is different from the U.S., but there is great support and push from the government for the industries to really try to do this kind of manufacturing by trying to give tax incentives and other incentives in trying to locate their plant in certain areas. So, yeah, and maybe the government is also trying to support them partly financially because of this drive. So they have a very very strong drive for this manufacturing, and well, anyway, they have a big market because of their population. But the role of government is very important, and I remember this is not with the electric vehicle manufacturing that I could remember. Also in the manufacturing industries in Japan, um, there has been a strong push by the government to do industrial production. And for example, now this is in the semiconductor field, wherein TSMC is investing in Japan also for semiconductors. They create whole communities, even new whole communities, to do this industry. So they have a program that's called It Takes a Village. So yeah, I think, of course, for the US side, as I would see even also in semiconductor manufacturing, because they have a roadmap and a program. So government, I think, is very very important. But well, in your setting, that is for you to answer that question further. Yeah, I'd like to welcome Chavis. Chavis, welcome to the stage. I think you want
Hi,
to make
hi,
a comment.
Cecile. Yeah, so I think it's great opportunity for computer engineer like me, to develop the AI for autonomous car and as well as the boosting of developing the batteries, the new type of the batteries using. So in for high educated people, they got what they get, they get a lot of, it created a lot of jobs for me. Like for example, I developed the ideas of using the magnetic field to trap the charge instead of using electric field to do the quantum batteries. So and there are many, many opening question that we could develop further into the AI and the optimization of the batteries and so on. So I think that will be great for me. It open up the jobs and possibility for doing R&D and so on. But the things that are concerned is that the transition between the change. I think we need to optimize the transition time. Otherwise, the labor workers, they will lose their job. So I think if they still, if they have already worked in this you know the company that building the car. So when there's something changed, then yeah, we need to keep them, not to lose the job. And yeah, what do you think how can we do that? I mean,
Yeah, thank you, Chavis. Do you have any comments, Andrew and Omar?
Yeah, maybe thanks. I'll start first, Travis. Thanks for your comment. I think you're speaking about this broad need to temper the rate of transitioning to any new technology, so we don't leave people behind. And I recognize that. I want to connect your comment to the work we were specifically presenting, though, and I think the big statement we want to make is that we don't think the conversation about EV jobs should be in the assembly plant. Like, if anything, our work shows that there'd be more jobs in the final assembly for these plants that are transitioning. And to hit on my earlier point, I think we need to move the conversation away from the assembly plants into the parts manufacturing. And you know, I think this is about retraining, reskilling workers who have, you know, a lot of experience with uh, uh, assembling mechanical parts. I'm talking about engines, transmission, and what will replace that job? I think it's battery manufacturing primarily. I'm talking about battery cell manufacturing and perhaps battery pack assembly. And if you look at the types of skills needed, they're quite different. Battery manufacturing is, depending on where you are in the factory, there's a lot of coding processes. Coding, that's why they, they actually like people who have worked in industry, in the paint industry, because there's similar coding methods that are used to make the electrodes. And there's also a lot of electronics. There's a lot of control technologies in these automated assembly plants towards the end of the cell manufacturing line. Um, and there's high voltage systems that people need to be trained on how to use high voltage systems, how to be safe. And I'm just highlighting a few skills and how these skills might need to be shifted towards the skills that are more compatible with battery manufacturing. Omar, do you want to have anything to add to that?
I don't know that I have anything else to add. Uh, to be
I just thought
honest,
I'd check. Okay.
yeah, thanks. It's a good question, and I think Andrew, you hit on the points that I would have said anyway.
Thank you, Andrew and Omar. I just have a curiosity question, which you will answer years from now. You presented the data here, some data on the slides, and I'm just wondering how will it change over even the next 2 or 3 years. That we have to see. So I think Chris was trying to unmic a while ago, so I'd like to give the mic to him.
Oh, I could talk about this for a long time with things. I want to respect the room format. I think Bob actually had some things he wanted to say with things. I wanted to picture go in order.
Yeah, earlier Bob has an app issue, so he could not come up the stage. So he was down for a while and really could not go up the stage. So,
We're
uh,
happy to have you up
so go ahead, Chris, if you have something to say. I know you have a lot to say.
here. That is, yes. Uh, for folks that are arriving here with things, I've hosted like where we do like like week-long monologues on things for climate change or AI and stuff. Sometimes
I'm
those that can
inviting
be
you to
pretty popular.
another forum with that monologue for one day.
I mean, look, if we wanted to, like, I mean, Cecile, I don't think it's a really good. I think it's a good use of my time where people hear with things, but we could, if we just started right now, we could create like a 3-day miniature conference on this one topic, and I can guarantee you, within about 2 or 3 days, we would have thousands of people in here, and they'd be all calling out, "There's something happening," but that is exhausting to do. But I did. There's good times here, but I did have a one specific question. I'll try to keep this relatively narrow because I want to be respectful for guest time, and I'm very grateful for you coming here with things because we appreciate your time. Uh, what are your opinions on BYD and how they do things with iron rice bowl jobs over in China? They have a different labor strategy over there, but when you're talking about the ultimate capability of having labor productivity or concentration, it's something that is very, very nuanced depending on the sector you're in, but also the geography. They have different data sets that are available, and it's a different set of incentives for what things that they don't want to share with outsiders versus things that they do. I'm just curious if you had an opportunity of ways of analyzing some of the data sets from overseas.
Dang, that's the narrow question.
Oh, yeah.
No, I'm kidding.
You
We
got it,
have,
Omar. It's all you.
yeah, I got. Well, the short answer is no. We haven't had a chance to look at any of the data sets overseas. We've talked to people who are at least in the circles of people who would know things about what's going on overseas, and they definitely find interest in our work and and they see the relevance of it. But looking at a case like BYD is it in a
We need to
d-
figure out a way to get you a policy person to get you on a plane to go fly over to a factory over there and ask some questions. I'm very serious
yes.
about this because there's a lot of politic points that are pivoting on this on either side of the Pacific with this, and a lot of that is pivoting on. You know, you see things like, oh, we're pro union, we're not as strong union, we're pro business. It's like, well, wait, but a lot of these are contingent on more or less fantasies of you
Hmm.
know perceived alliances. The fact is you took a set of uh, data sets that were anonymized and de-anonymized them and then went, hey, by the way, here's what's actually going on. It's not what people are saying. um,
Yeah.
I don't think you guys were necessarily supposed to do that. I think the way it typically works is they commission 4 or 5 different research teams and they all go find different results and they pick the one that's more favorable and they give that a bunch of press and say, this is why we're going to do insert arbitrary policy position here. You actually want to find out what's actually going on, and that is very interesting. So if you keep digging in this direction, you're going to find some very counterintuitive sorts of stuff, and I'd love to see you guys in a position where you can find more of those sorts of counterintuitive results because I think they'll be very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Thank you. I'm glad you appreciate the work we're doing. I think with BYD, it's like at a very high level, I think the case of BYD illustrates just how much work there is to optimize the battery manufacturing process, right? So that's how BYD has really gotten the edge that they've gotten is they're a battery company first, and they have a decade or so of experience, maybe more at this point of figuring out how to make batteries really efficiently. And so much of that has to do with vertical integration, which is a theme that we brought up in our little corner of analysis with our work as well. But these guys really figured out how to vertically integrate their supply chain for battery manufacturing, spent a bunch of time getting really good at that, and then applied that expertise into making a car. So, depending on the perspective that you use to look at it, to go back to what I said about perspective really matters, if the sole purpose is to drastically accelerate mass adoption of EVs, we need cars that are as cheap as possible that can offer comparable range and are supported by ample charging infrastructure, right? Those are the goals that we need to get to. So BYD has offered a case study in how do you get to at least one of those components, which is a really cheap electric car. They really hammered out the weakness that is currently holding back electric cars in price, which is the cost of the battery manufacturing itself. And they offer a playbook on how to do that, which is to vertically integrate as much of the supply chain as possible. Now, doing that in other sociopolitical contexts is a whole other question. Like, how do you do that in the US? And is that something that we should be doing in the US? And then you get into all kinds of uh, disagreements and discussions about who's benefiting, how would US workers be affected by that kind of process, if it even could be supported by American policy, right? Because so much of battery manufacturing is becoming a very automated process. So yeah, it's just such a difficult thing to try to unpack, even as a thought experiment. Like you could we could just go on and about it. But those are my initial thoughts about a case like BYD, is that they technically offer this blueprint of how to move forward depending on what you think the goal is with this EV transition. But there's questions about, is that actually the goal that benefits the most people in the long run, and how would you even get there, even if you could get everyone on board about what the goal really is.
Just real quick, and I'll turn it back over to the room, but I just want to do just a brief little thing of China with USA thing on the specific parts of the vehicles, because I think that would kind of send the conversation down an interesting direction. You just mentioned that the parts that are upstream of the assembly plant are where a lot of follow-up studies can be made. And I think just a very brief highlight of some of the differences in production methods, I think that might actually be kind of interesting. We can go really just fly through this. So as an example, you brought up the batteries. when you China looking at this as a long-term strategy, what they're looking at, I mean, there's only like 5 or 6 parts in an electric vehicle. There's more subsystem assemblies, a little more accurate. But on the batteries, uh, there was a time frame when USA had an opportunity to really create an integrated universal strategy about this. At the time, though, it was very haphazard. We had work happening out at National Renewable Energy Laboratory, a lot of the work at NREL. We had work that was happening both with the solar production, and it was being tied in with the idea of saying, well, we're transitioning off of lead acid batteries. We have this kind of moment we can do something. And they more or less just let it slip. China embraced it as a national state policy, saying this is a chance for us to not just be China copies other things. Well, they do, but the thing is, they can actually lead. And this is sectors where they are now leading in drones, they're leading in electronics, they're leading in batteries, they're leading in uh, the solar panels. And this ties into a universal strategy because if you want to build the battery networks, how large the battery has to be is entirely dependent on how far away the chargers are from each other. How many solar panels you have and where they're deployed dictates how big the battery packs need to be. The fact is that on a Chinese vehicle, they don't need to have the battery packs be nearly as large because they have more solar panels deployed in more places. The energy availability is more planned out. So what that means is they can sell the cars much, much, much cheaper. Right now, you've got the main American manufacturers that are begging the government to put massive tariffs on imports. I mean, this almost happened with Japan actually back in the day. Japan was flooding the market with cheap vehicles that were obliterating domestic supplies for manufacturers, saying we can't employ these and compete at this. Japan voluntarily limited their number of exports just to maintain friendly relations. But that was something they did on their side voluntarily rather than something that was done with a tariff or a quota with things. But the reason why it's relevant is they're asking for a similar set of things for China's imports. And the reason why that matters is because we're now at a point where a lot of American vehicles are not competitive on the international market for exports. And that's huge because that means that the total amount of dollars flowing into the industry is going to shrink over time unless American manufacturers can be more competitive with price points on Chinese models that are sometimes coming in as cheap as 10% of the cost of what we're able to make with our best technology and most highly trained labor. That's a big problem. So if you have this happen at the same time, you promise jobs to people, regardless of whether or not they have the skills or whether or not you have the ability to train people for those abilities. It's not necessarily something that's going to be a long-term position, but it's something that you have to navigate in the short term in a way that is actually going to be uh, consequential for the industry in a good way. The problem is you have so many different actors that have unstated motivations that it really clouds the judgment of how this is going to work. So you can go down system by system, everything from like the infotainment systems, where it's like the insurance companies are selling out surveillance data for that. But then, do you really need to have that for every single part of the vehicle? When the CHIPS Act through, uh, before it went through, one of the big motivations was COVID supply chains have destroyed automotive. We can't get our vehicles made. You find out what actually happens is they gave them manufacturing slots because they were on the last generation of chips, and they were basically couldn't ship $50,000 vehicles because they weren't willing to pay 30 cents for a chip, and so they gave up their manufacturing slots. And then when they got like consumer units, they're like, "Well, we have our slots back," and they're like, "No, no, we don't feel like it." And so that almost kicked off an early wave of electrification faster than they would have liked to, just because otherwise the factories are sitting with near final park of vehicles, but they frack something up with like one random sensor that's on the brake unit. Oh yeah, it's also in the entertainment unit. So there's like all these dynamics that are in play. But what happens is it means that we have a lot more exposure to information that is not in keeping what's actually going on. And that's very difficult when you're in an academic position, is you have to really go into splitting out what's the public information and what's the actual story going on. And so I respect your work in going out and finding out what the actual story is. Anyways, that was a long little rant thing, but thanks for coming here, and I really appreciate you spending your time here. Thanks, best.
Thank you so much, Chris. Before Andrew or Omar would have some comment here, I would just like to ask if, um, yeah, we've been here for 2 hours, so I think uh, I had requested Andrew and Omar to at least be here for 1.5 hours. So anyway, I'd like to ask if they have some comment for Chris. statement a while ago, and after that, maybe we will prepare to wrap up, and probably we can come back. You can come back again, Andrew and Omar. There's a lot of interest in what you're studying, and we can just have an open discussion.
Yeah, I can stay for probably 10 more minutes and trying to, Chris said a lot there. I'm trying to unpack all of it. Um, yeah, you really hit on a lot of points. I think if I can summarize what you're saying, I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now in, you know, what is going to happen in the future of electric vehicles and batteries and battery technology and the ownership of that technology trajectory. Right now, I mean, Chris, I mean, I think you're basically saying we missed our shot. I mean, like that's what happened, and we're in kind of a not so great place right now in terms of our ownership in this technology. I think what's going to
You have
happen
to
in the
get
next
organized very quickly.
have to get organized. Thanks. Do not despair. Well, what I I honestly, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to discuss here. I think um, what's happening right now is joint ventures, right, between domestic automakers and international battery suppliers, right? And because of the tensions between the US and China, I think a lot of automakers are looking at other places, right? South Korea, right? Companies like LG, Samsung, and maybe even Japan in Panasonic. So what's going to happen is that, um, I think the U.S. government is going to mandate that these batteries are going to be produced domestically. So these overseas companies are going to set up shop, and that's going to end up creating jobs. I think it's going to end up creating jobs. There's already been a lot of announcements in different parts of the U.S. where companies overseas are setting up shop here. Um, I think it's another thing to own the technology and to really understand what's going on as these manufacturing factories, right? These battery factories are open. How much IP do you think they're going to share with engineers or U.S. engineers? I'm willing to bet not a whole lot. Um, so I think that's kind of the landscape I'm thinking we're in right now, and I honestly don't have great ideas of how to get out of it. Because I think I'm trying to connect all of this back to the labor conversation, right? And you had asked Chris earlier about BYD and what's going on there. I'm actually not sure what we would do with that data, even if we were to get it from BYD somehow, right? To de-anonymize it, as you say. The reason why I say that is because I think the US is in such a different labor landscape. We don't have that many, like the employment rate is not that high right now, right? And we want, fair wages for all of our workers. So, between this and that, I think the way we develop manufacturing technology should be informed by the constraints of the labor market in the US. And I'm, I'm I think, I don't have any data on BYD. I really don't know what's going on there, but I'm, if I were to guess, like they probably have more workers to do stuff that, people are just going to be willing to work for less pay, right? At least for now, right? So I don't think it's an apples to apples comparison right now to compare between what's happening in BYD and what we want to achieve domestically. So for what it's worth, I think that's my reflection on your point with BYD. Um, and I think that's all I wanted to say. Yeah.
So we're going to wrap up soon. I think Chris has some last comment before we wrap up. Chris?
Yeah, just a last comment. I just want to say thank you for your time. This is the sort of conversations that I joined Clubhouse for, and I'm very grateful that the tradition continues even to the present day. So thank you so much for your time coming here, and it's been a real honor having you share knowledge with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today, Chris. I will get in touch with you soon. And I would like to give the mic to Andrew and Omar. Thank you so much. We hope you can be our guests again. And we are rooting for the continuation of your research. So, Andrew and Omar, I'd like to give the mic to you for some parting shot before we close the room.
Should I go? I go first? Okay, I can go first. I just want to say thank you, Cecile. Thank you to the group for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity to share our work. To anyone who's listened in at any point, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn, find us wherever, and we'd really love to just keep this going as a conversation, get your feedback, get your input. If you haven't checked out the link to the paper, please find that in the chat as well. There's obviously a lot more detail and depth of our work in the paper itself as the main document. So feel free to check that out if you haven't. Yeah, we really just want to keep this conversation going because there's a lot of implications, and I think we've proven we can talk about this for hours and hours and not find any end, but that's what makes this such important work that can really affect a lot of people's lives on the ground. So we really appreciate anything that we can do to keep the conversation going and inspire more people to do work in this area. So thank you all for being a part of that.
Yeah, everything what Omar said. Cecile, I really appreciate you reaching out to us and inviting us to speak. I hope everybody enjoyed our discussion, and it was great to be here.
Yeah, thanks again, Andrew and Omar. And I would like to tell everyone that if you came late in the conversation, you can hear this conversation in our YouTube channel. Just Google Quantum Photonics Club. Maybe in about a week's time or less, Bob will be able to transcribe it to upload this conversation, the edited version of this conversation, to our YouTube channel. And he syncs the slides that the speakers try to use here with what the speakers are saying. So please check that out. And thank you so much, Bob, for being patient to do that. So I'd like to turn over the mic to Bob now to say some final words and do the countdown to close the room. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Andrew and Omar. And good night, everybody. See you in the next rooms.